the United States at this time. The images I'm going to show you are from a publication from the 1890s from a journalist. His name was Jacob A. Riis. He's what they called during this time period a muckraker. And what a muckraker was an investigative journalist. What a muckraker did was kind of document and investigate sort of really important social issues in the United States and write and report on them, oftentimes in books or newspapers, out of an attempt to get the American democracy thinking about important issues and how to address them. Jacob A. Riis was really a journalist and a photographer, a muckraker, and he took his camera throughout New York City and photographed the sort of extreme poverty of the working and lower classes in New York City at the time. And he published this in a book called How the Other Half Lives. And this is during a time period, again, when the other half would have referred to the, overwhelming majority of Americans that controlled a very small percentage of the American wealth, and particularly in this case, the Americans that lived in slums or were homeless or on the streets in New York City. So things to think about here before I show you some of these images and talk about them. It's important to remember. So at this time period, over 50% of the wealth was controlled by the richest 1%. 86% of the wealth of the United States was controlled by 12% of the population. In addition, there's very, very little in the way of federal funding and federal government action to deal with some of the issues of extremes of inequality. There were some orphanages, there were frontier houses, for example. Hull House, for example, was one of the most famous so-called frontier houses that were designed to deal with people who were in very difficult situations at the time. But these were largely private entities, and there's really no robust program of support provided by the federal government. Why is this? In part, it has to do with the attitude of those in government. Remember, this is the period of the forgettable presidents. They don't really see their responsibility to be as an activist leader, but rather to oversee business as usual. But you also have to remember this is a period when there is no income tax, so there's no tax on the income of the wealthiest. There's no tax on the income of Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie or J.P. Morgan. So there's no income tax for the federal government at this time. There's not a robust public education system. Most young people don't complete high school, and illiteracy rates are quite high relative to today. In addition, it should be noted that most people that were in the working class sort of industries, manufacturing and so forth, were doing work that was mechanized. It was run by machines, and you were trained to work machines. And ultimately, because of the revolution of machine manufacturing, perhaps not unlike the current ongoing revolution in industry of automation, because of that, workers who had formerly had skills were now unskilled workers. And there's no government policy saying that a worker has to be paid a certain amount. There really are no meaningful, programs for pensions. There's no laws from the federal government about workers' safety, pensions, health care, unemployment. None of that stuff exists. And so if you're a coal miner in West Virginia, if you get injured on the job and you can no longer work, your family is probably going to be destitute. And most coal miners, which it was not a glamorous job at all, most coal miners died in debt because they were paid so little, and the companies often owned the very town that they lived in. Sometimes they weren't even paid in dollars. They were paid in credits from the company that would then be sent to and paid at the company store. So just to give you some of the idea about just how difficult it is for people if you happen to be a working class individual in an unskilled position. So from how the other half lived, a major problem in New York City, and remember, New York City, largest city in the United States, and at the time, 2/3 of the population lived in slums. This is a very famous, or infamous, I suppose, picture of the extreme child poverty in New York City. People oftentimes died at younger ages. There was still a growing revolution in medicine, but it had a long way to go before you get to the age of antibiotics and antiviral drugs and other types of treatments. And so, cities were dirty. You might have an outbreak of cholera from something that's polluted the drinking water. The rivers were polluted. Tuberculosis was rampant in cities, which is tuberculosis is an infection of the lungs. It's very contagious when it's in the air. And so adults sometimes died young, and so there was a lot of child poverty, orphans. There weren't enough orphanages to take them in, and so they lived on the streets. And they oftentimes, you might see them as a source of sympathy, but they oftentimes too were engaged in, street sort of crime because they're doing what is necessary in their desperate state to survive. Tenement houses. This is a picture from a New York City tenement house in the 1890s, again from Jacob A. Ries's How the Other Half Lives. The tenement houses, tenement house is a kind of a word for a sort of cheaper end apartment, shall we say. And the New York City tenement houses during the 1800s, late 1800s, were notorious. They were notorious for being dirty. They were notorious for being overcrowded. They were notorious for having very poor ventilation. And when you have a place like this and it's overcrowded, it's not clean, it's very poorly ventilated, if somebody gets tuberculosis, TB, well, everybody's going to get it. And it was a really infectious disease, and people would live with this for a period of time, but ultimately it's fatal. And at this time, out in the countryside, they often had tuberculosis, medical relief homes built, actually. They were usually basked in places of sunlight because sunlight would kill tuberculosis. To give you an idea of what it might have been like in one of these tenement houses, and these burned down all the time, by the way. They were all kinds of attempts by the city of New York at this time to pass laws that would regulate the issues with the tenement houses because they burned down a lot. They had very poor building codes, not to mention being overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and like in many cases, disease incubators. On a floor of a tenement house like this, these were called dumbbell tenements often because if you looked at it from the sky, it looked kind of like a dumbbell, and they had one ventilation shaft. Each floor, and I want you to imagine this, each floor in one of these tenement houses had one toilet in many cases. That's not per apartment, that's per floor. Every single person on the floor is using the same bathroom. And so you can again see what those situations might be like living there in terms of sanitary conditions and so forth. It's another look at tenement houses in New York City at this time, and you can see the electrification pole here going up. You're on the precipice where individuals like Thomas Edison are beginning to use the DC power currents to provide electrification in some urban areas like New York. So you're kind of at the cross section between the emergence of electrification and also the automobile as well. This is inside a tenement house. Many of the immigrants in these tenement houses came from Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and they worked in various industries, and they lived in tight, cramped quarters like this, living and sleeping together and working together, trying to pursue the American dream But oftentimes in these situations, very, very difficult, particularly for the first generation of immigrants to achieve the American dream because of the many difficulties associated with being not only working class, but also an immigrant in New York City. There was a great deal of discrimination towards people, not only towards African American people, but towards different ethnic and religious groups. There was a great deal of anti-Semitism. There was anti-Chinese sentiments, and even anti-Italian or anti-Slavic Eastern European sentiments. And people were discriminated against. Irish Catholic people were infamously discriminated against quite heavily in New York City during the latter 1800s. Another look inside of one of these tenement houses, you get a really feel for just how kind of dirty and how difficult these settings were. I mean, you can see the mold on the ceiling, and if you look in this one picture here and you see the sleeping quarters, you can count. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people just in that photo. And you can kind of look on these people's faces. These are people that are scrambling every day, looking for work each day, working whatever job they can get and receiving whatever pay they can receive. And you can kind of really get a feeling from looking at their faces of how difficult in existence this was. This individual here is probably not much older than most college students. And you can see the tiredness on their faces, I think. Again, you look at the streets of one of the slums of New York at this time. Again, you see the electrification happening here. You can also see, just get a feel for what it was like walking through the streets of New York City in the late 1890s as the city grew with rising influence of immigration from Europe, particularly at this time, a new wave of immigrants coming into the United States at this time, particularly from Southeastern and Central Europe. This is an example, again, from Jacob A. Riis of homelessness. There's mass homelessness. Thousands of people were homeless in New York City. This individual is under like kind of a makeshift lean-to that's positioned near the city dump. So there's extremes of homelessness and poverty, and these individuals would have had to live on the streets and make it through as best that they could. Another example of homelessness in New York City during the 1890s. Again, these are from Jacob A. Riis's How the Other Half Lives, and they really give you an incredible shot at what life for the other half was like in New York City over a century ago. Now this image here is a very interesting image for a number of reasons. This was called a 10-cent dive. Sometimes they were called morgues. And what this is, it's an unlicensed saloon. So many of the people that were on the streets or working in very poorly paid types of positions might visit these 10-cent dives. And these were kind of illegal, unlicensed saloons. They were typically underneath or around and out of the way of legitimate restaurants. And what they would do is they would, the people who ran these places would get the moldy, stale bread that had been put out, right, that they weren't going to serve in the real restaurant anymore. And you might get a piece of floor to sleep on. So you would pay your 10 cent. You would get a piece of old bread. You would get a piece of floor. Some places might have a cot to sleep on, and you would be given a pint of the dregs. And if anybody has ever heard the term drinking the dregs, what that refers to, dregs, the beer in a pub like this at this time is generally unfiltered beer. And so unfiltered beer has like kind of bits in it that will ultimately settle to the bottom of a beer keg, a beer cask. And so when you get close to the bottom of that, the real restaurants, the legitimate restaurants, would not serve it because the taste goes off a bit. It becomes more potent. The alcohol content goes up. It's just generally not a drink that was servable in a licensed restaurant. And so they would put the cask out in these unlicensed saloons, would take those casks, and they would serve the dregs. And that's where the terms like the dregs of society comes from at this time. This is also an interesting photo because this was one of the establishments like this that was not racially segregated. And so here you see amongst the other individuals, you see in the foreground an African-American individual, because this particular establishment allowed all people to come to it, whereas many establishments, regardless of geographic region in the United States, were discriminated on and segregated against on the grounds of race. And so that's another interesting aspect of this photo. Here's an example of what some of the cots might look like in one of these kind of basement unlicensed saloons, if you were fortunate enough to have a cot to sleep on for your 10 cents. Now, last slide for this segment. The question that society must deal with is, how should society approach issues of wealth and poverty? Do you do nothing about it? Do you do something about it? What is the issue here? During the 1890s, generally in the Gilded Age, the extremes of this debate were really between a robust sort of like socialism, which would mean pretty thorough government action to sort of eliminate extremes of wealth and to use the proceeds to sort of lift up those in the lower echelons of society. Socialism is a term that Americans tend to really misunderstand, but it's actually a really, there's a lot of different kinds of socialism. You have communism on the one hand, where it's basically total government control. And then you have like social democracy, which you see in the modern world today, like a country like Germany, which is very democratic, and which the government taxes things a little higher, but uses those things to provide housing and healthcare and these types of things. And the United States even employs certain elements of reform socialism with programs like Social Security, Medicare, the GI Bill of Rights, and these types of things. But anyway, we'll talk more about that later in the course. But the extremes of this were, versions of socialism. There was an individual named Edward Bellamy who wrote a book called Looking Backward. And looking backward in this book, Edward Bellamy basically explains that, or it's a novel. And he basically, in this book, kind of does the Rip Van Winkle. I don't know if any of you have heard the story of Rip Van Winkle, where the individual falls asleep for 20 years and wakes up and everything's changed. In his story, his character falls asleep during the Gilded Age, and it's this terribly dirty industrial wealth, extremes of wealth and equality era. He falls asleep in it. He wakes up 100 years later, at the turn of the 21st century, basically, and it's like a utopia. And everybody shops at the same stores, and they all get the same music pumped into that they want to listen to, pumped into their apartments, and all of the sidewalks are covered. So it's not just the rich people who don't get wet. It was designed as a real like socialist criticism of these extremes of wealth and equality during this period. We're going to read the primary source, Progress and Poverty, which is an example kind of reform socialism or social democracy, which these ideas proposed that you shouldn't get rid of capitalism, but you should just use certain types of reform measures like taxing the land of the richest people or taxing the income of the richest people, and using those things to pay workers more or to build schools to improve communities. The other extreme of this period was social Darwinism. And the main proponents of social Darwinism were individuals like Herbert Spencer, William Graham Sumner, and these individuals argued that effectively they used the ideas of Charles Darwin, his evolutionary theories, and they used them and they attempted to apply those to society. Interestingly, that whole phrase, survival of the fittest, was never used by Charles Darwin. It's actually used by social Darwinists. And Charles Darwin did not necessarily, this is not Social Darwinism doesn't have anything to do with the writings of Charles Darwin. They're just taking his ideas and applying it to society. And these individuals said, look, don't do anything to tax the wealthiest people. They're wealthy because they're the most fit. They deserve to be celebrated, and it would be somehow unnatural to take from them and to give to the poor. So those are kind of the extremes of the debate. And in religion even, there was sort of a prosperity gospel by individuals like Reverend Russell Conwell, who gave famous sermons called the Acres of Diamond sermons, in which they celebrated as virtuous the wealth of individuals like Rockefeller and Carnegie and so forth. So those are the extremes. And so the question I want you to think about is there a middle path? Maybe Henry George is a middle path. Maybe there's another middle path. Is there a middle path here to the extremes of this debate over how to deal with